again and welcome. I am James Robinson, the creator of Homestead. And while we are on break from season 2 into season 3, I'm giving you a chance to meet the people who create the characters that you love so much. Today, we're talking with Danny Hettum. Danny,
Bye.
thank you so much. So why don't we start and you tell us a little bit about your character?
All right. Well, Wheeler, the beauty thing about Wheeler is him and I are very kindred spirits for the most part. We basically have the same kind of banter. We address problems very similarly, but for the most part, he tends to be kind of the catch-all net for the characters of Fox and Cohen as kind of their, I don't know, I'm kind of their undecided, like, extra vote, but without actually having the power to do much of anything. But he's Homestead's handyman. But yeah, he's always kind of like the troubleshooter that nobody ever wants to hear the opinion of because typically it goes against what they want to do. He does have bipolar, which is a factor in his character, but it typically doesn't come up often, which I think is a fair point to most people with bipolar, that it's, yes, it is a factor of your character, but it is not your character, which I found to be rather entertaining to attempt. And I've been very grateful for the fact that I've had people with bipolar, help me kind of develop it and showcase it at its height and its lows, which I think at least brings a little bit of realism to the character. And yeah, that's something that I've greatly appreciated about him. Not only that, but for all of his awesome intellect and heightened sense of intelligence, he is flawed inherently, but that's not necessarily due to the bipolar. He's flawed because he sees a way of things getting done, and he knows that he has these great friends who are in positions where they could actually enact the change, and through them, he's basically like the consigliere to the leadership of Homestead, and I think he likes that position.
You talked a little bit about how you think you're similar. Give us more examples of how you are similar to Wheeler.
A lot of the times when confronted with an issue or a problem that comes up in Homestead, I mean, a lot of the stuff they do is kind of detrimental to survival, but he tends to try to pad things out with a little bit of humor to kind of break the mood. It tends to be more subtle humor and a bit more of an approach of avant-garde, where he basically is just trying to fuck with you just to break the mood. Not necessarily to be funny, just to try to throw you off enough to where you stop thinking about it. And then he'll hit you with something of importance, or when he actually does come with a serious tone, you can always tell because he doesn't make it funny. He doesn't try to bring humor into it. He tries to stay direct on the point. It's like, hey, something's wrong and we need to fix this. And very much like myself, that's how I address a lot of issues, is when it's important, I typically will drop most humor because I know it's something that needs to be addressed importantly, and that's just kind of how I approach things. And for the most part, he seems to be a kind of devil-may-care kind of individual where, shit sucks, but why bog yourself down with it, We do the best we can, we do what we can, and we move on.
He's just making the most of the life that he has.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's doing all right for himself.
Yeah, it doesn't suck.
How would you say that Wheeler's evolved from season 1 until now?
Well, from season 1, Wheeler was very much just kind of like the handyman, kind of like a little bit of a joke slinger, but basically he was kind of a setup guy. We didn't really know much about him. We just knew that he was somebody who held an importance to the two main leads, and we didn't really necessarily understand much of why that was important to the story. Come season 2, we realized that they hold his opinion in a fairly high esteem, so much so that once Fox, went off the radar, Wheeler was able to kind of step in and take over the second in command because of how much influence he has over Cohen, or with Cohen at least. as his, kind of troubleshooter, you come to realize that there's a lot more going on in his head than previously exposed. I think that's the best part about the evolution of his character, was he went from being just kind of a one-liner, maybe a little bit quippy here and there, to somebody who actually was standing shoulder to shoulder with the head of Homestead going, hey, we're kind of fucking this up here, bud, and it actually was taking into consideration, because a little bit of realization from the other characters going, hey, Wheeler's not entirely wrong. And he's kind of becoming more of the voice of the population rather than the voice of just the quippy one-liner. And I think I really appreciated that, and the dynamic that has been built between his character and Abby has also been a showcase of, his emotional state, and, where his heart truly lies, and where his importances are, his values are a bit more developing over time, and you learn about his strengths as well as his weaknesses.
We haven't really explored his backstory much. Do you have, like, in your mind, do you have a backstory for where he came from and how he got to Homestead?
Honestly,
is that something you think about when you voice him?
Not particularly, no, because a lot of the times I like to leave like the backstory development up to the writer. But at the same time, I can't help but just channel him through my own experiences, because again, the character of Wheeler and myself kind of share similar wisdoms in that. And those were gained from, industrial grade working, and, constantly going through drudgery and just trying to make the best of a bad situation. So honestly, when I think of his backstory, I typically think of him as an average jackoff who literally just kind of happened upon something better than what he had before, or an idea that is greater than the sum of himself. And he's just happy to be on for the ride, essentially. But he's not going to sit back and idly sit by while stuff starts to fall apart. He's going to take an active role in making sure that things move forward. Which again, I can't help but pull that from myself, just because that's kind of how I address things,
Mm-hmm. So what would you say is Wheeler's biggest secret?
Biggest secret?
Yeah.
Shoo. I mean, I know that there are some characters within the Homestead universe that are aware of his bipolar, but I think he tries to keep that as much under wraps as possible, because I think even he understands that if that gets out to the mass populace, then he becomes not unreliable, but I think there's always the question of unreliability, and he likes to be able to be that guy. And he knows that that's not necessarily the case, obviously, because having bipolar doesn't discredit you from being valuable. But I think that's something you gain from having somewhat of an invisible disorder, is you're constantly concerned about how other people will view you after they learn about it. And we kind of learned a little bit about that when Fox and Cohen were introduced to it, I think in season 1,
Mm-hmm.
where, he became somewhat of a wild card due to his invisible disability. But it wasn't a bad thing necessarily. It was just a little bit hazardous. So both Fox and Cohen learned how to kind of work with it. But at the same time, nothing he was saying at the time was wrong. It was just a little more blunt and direct than they might have approached. So I think that's probably one of his biggest secrets. Also, I think one of the things I've put into Wheeler is one of the secrets he holds is he does want to be in charge, but he doesn't want to say that he wants to be in charge. He's fine with doing whatever's needed whenever it's needed, but a part of him's kind of going, I think I might be able to do this better.
Mm-hmm.
But he never wants to admit that, because again, admitting that kind of makes him seem like the power hungry asshole that we've come to realize Warner for. See, Warner puts it out on the surface, and I think even he sees that enough to go, that's not the guy I want to be.
Yeah.
And he'd rather be the second in command helping enact real change than being in command by vocally saying, hey, sign me up for the job. So I would say that might be one of them.
So let me ask you, what's been the biggest challenge playing Wheeler over 2 seasons?
I mean, reading the scripts is really hard.
So reading, essentially?
Yeah, you know, it's hard because there's like punctuation and things. No, one of the tough parts about Wheeler is the level of intensity that I bring to him. Sometimes doesn't necessarily match up with what is needed for the character. So it's like I'll read something and I'll go, that sounds kind of chill. And then I try to bring it relaxed, and it's like, no, we need that a little more up. And it's like, oh, fuck, okay. And so I try to bring that intensity to him that doesn't normally click for me, but it clicks for the character, and that's what's more important. So stuff like that, I find that like when things are highly intense and you can read it on the page that this is a stressful situation, I love those moments because that challenges me to really kind of dig deep and find a level of irritation that I can vocalize. But for the most part, Wheeler seems to be very, like I said, devil may care kind of attitude where he doesn't really care, but he's going to voice that he does. So I found that to be kind of difficult.
What's been the easiest part of playing Wheeler?
Everything. No. No, honestly, the easiest parts for me is when he's at a peak of intensity, because that's when I get to just channel everything about, you know, what I would imagine somebody who is at that point. Like for the people listening to this, hopefully they'd listened to all of season 2 and they got to hear my argument with Cohen, you know, my throwdown fucking screaming match. That was probably the easiest read I've ever had in my life. And it was only because I was channeling pure irritation with somebody I love. And it came from a place of genuine concern, frustration, and all of the things that have been built up over the course of the season, just vomiting out forward. And it felt like a nice release. It was like, yes, finally, I get to just, yeah. And I felt like both Travis and myself really fed on each other's energies for that particular scene. So it's like he was irritated with me and just throwing his lines out, and I was just grabbing them, and they were hitting the back of my head. It's like, and it felt really nice, and it was really easy. And even going over the lines, it was like, oh fuck, God, I hope I can do this. And as soon as we started rolling, it was like, I got some things to say to you, buddy. And it was really nice. It was really easy. And again, like the playful banter that he does, it comes very natural to me because thankfully the writer really knows me. So, you know, he kind of writes for me.
Gold star for him.
Right? No shit, Jesus. But yeah, I mean, that's what I would say is probably the easiest is when he's at his highs. I typically tend to thrive on those.
So I got to know, this past season, what was your favorite moment?
Oh, the argument through and through. Like, I mean, there was a lot of great moments throughout. I mean, the attack on OHSU was a lot of fun too. But that argument, I think, was not only well crafted and well put together, but damn, it just felt like channeling. And it just felt natural and it felt clean, and it came out so venomous, and it was like, oh man, that felt good. For as bad as I feel about saying all that stuff, that felt really good.
Yeah, but let's be honest, he kind of deserved it.
A lot. A lot. I mean, you know, there were times where I'm reading my lines, it's like, you know, getting punched in the face is kind of the least you deserve here, bud. Jerk. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I would say that was probably one of the funner moments for me, particularly when doing the voice acting. I mean, again, I've had a lot of really good scenes. I've had a lot of really great scenes. But that one always stood out to me as like, ooh, that was nice.
So let me ask you this: if you could play any other character, who would you like to play and why?
Warner. Maybe like
You are the second person to say that, so that's very interesting.
Well, it's one of those things where being the bad guy is funner, and I mean, a lot of the times with whatever, medium you're playing in, being the bad guy is always the funnest because you can bring such a different mindset to your character and you can voice things that you would never say in real life, and you can live this character. It's kind of like when you play GTA and you just murder innocent, NPCs. It's a part of that where it's like you get to have fun being the bad guy. Because being the good guy, yeah, it's your first playthrough and you're always the good guy first playthrough, but your second playthrough, you just want to watch the world burn. And honestly, a lot of the time too, that's where the challenge of the acting comes in, more so than being the good guy. Because I think at heart, most of us are, genuine people. So when confronted with a character or an actor or anything like that, that has to be just made of vile shit, it's more of a challenge and it's more exciting because you get to kind of channel the darker sides of yourself. So again, I always like the idea of playing a bad guy because, again, it's funner.
Well, you should talk to the writer then.
I should have a really long conversation about, hey,
So let me pose this scenario. Hollywood comes calling. They pick up Homestead and they want to make it into a movie, but you get to cast who plays Wheeler. Who do you pick?
See, and I've had a really, really hard time with this because I think, like, I had been brought this question up before, and honestly, I was having a hell of a time with it. Honestly, if I was to give Wheeler to anybody who I thought could actually pull it off, I'd give it to Jason Momoa. Only because he has the character actor where he can be that fun loving guy, big smile, but man, if he turns on the serious, you take a step and you go, maybe I should listen, because that's kind of the nature of who he is. And you're worried about him having a peak and valley because that becomes dangerous. Anybody else, he's physically daunting, which again, I always imagined Wheeler being of a sterner stout because he's a handyman, he's used to working with his hands. So you need somebody who's got a little bit of physical prowess. Plus, he's useful in a fight. But he has enough internal restraint to not molly stomp the ever-living hell out of somebody who just irritates him. And if he gets clocked in the face, he's going to come back, Yeah. The full beatdown that Wheeler got from Huxley and the others in season 1, I feel like Jason Momoa would have survived that very well and still been able to crack jokes at the end of it because of his physical prowess.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, I would give it up to him. I mean, again, a little bit to his vanity because can't help
you want to be Jason Momoa, just
fuck
say.
Yes, I do. And anybody who says they don't is lying.
So let me ask you this. If you were to write an episode of Homestead, what do you think your story would be?
The Wheeler Diaries. Honestly, I don't know because, again, I would be apprehensive about making a story that wasn't directly tied very close to the main cast, who we follow. If I was to write an episode, I think the only thing I would do is probably, I mean, it's really tough because I would maybe take a real hard look at Nicole. And I would bring a little backstory as to a bit more in-depth first-person view on how she ended up at the airport, what she did when the calamity hit, kind of giving a bit more character development to her story. Because, I mean, like Wheeler, the beauty part about Wheeler is, he's always been that guy who's been around. He's worked every job you've ever seen, you know, people working at. He was a nobody who just kind of just has, you know, usefulnesses that don't really come into play until they're needed. Nicole, she is such a character that I feel we haven't quite given that fair shake to just yet.
Yeah.
And fair, she's new to the game, but at the same time, it's like she is somebody of so much importance in our main character's backstory. And I think there's just a little bit of gray area. It's like, well, we know what happened back in high school, but how the hell did she end up here? You know, like what gave her the full circle and why is it important kind of thing. Honestly, that's probably where I would address, but much later down the road, because at this rate, we still got a lot of story to tell, but it would be something I would be curious to find out about because of the pivotal role she plays in Fox's life.
Or you could just go back to season 2 and listen to episode 7.
Well, true, but at the same time, again, I want a bit more in depth.
Yeah, you want to go through the experience with her.
Exactly. Yeah, rather than the just rattling off, yeah, I went here, I went here, I went here, and now I'm here. I would want a first person account, because even a vignette of, you know, what immediately happened as the calamity was going off, her first person take on everything. And honestly, I think that's something we've never really addressed either, is like first person accounts of when shit hit the fan. You know, we always introduced the show with it was the most virulent outbreak, you know, and by the end of it all, we were suffering, you know, a disease of the inhumane. It's like, well, we know how we got to where we are by the intro alone, but we've never actually seen a lot of first person takes on once the calamity hit. Like, what was your knee-jerk reaction? How many of the people of Homestead believed it would blow over in a week or a month or even a year and we'd all be back to normal? A little on the nose these days, but hey, what are you going to do? But after everything had gone through and we'd finally met with the total body count, and then we started seeing these groups of just awful people start to just take everything. And like that type of dynamic too has never really been touched on. I would be curious to see that evolution of each character. It's like, how did they initially deal with it? Did they shut down like, you know, the old Night of the Living Dead Barbara? Or did they, you know, decide, hey, I'm going to fucking do what I got to do. I got to toughen up. I got to be stronger, like the 1990s Barbara from Night of the Living Dead.
Okay,
you know
great.
I mean?
Well, I expect that first draft on my desk Monday morning.
Shit. Again, it would just be one of those things like from a listener point of view, because I will go back and I'll listen to the episodes when I'm at work, even though I hate the sound of my own voice. It's kind of one of those things where it's nice to kind of follow the narrative. And from a third party outsider view, like I allow myself to detach myself from the character and I just listen to it from an audience perspective. And it's like, the questions I come up with are typically the ones I offer to you, because they're the ones it's like, as a listener, I'm curious about this. But on the whole, I mean, again, brownie points to you, boss. I mean, it is really well written and poorly acted on my part, but that's your fault for casting me. So, you know, hey, you get what you pay for, sweetheart.
So I got one more question for you before we wrap this up. And that is, what do you see in Wheeler's future? Where do you think he's going to go? No spoilers.
You know, dictatorship, nuclear warfare. I mean, no, honestly, again, I think in Wheeler's future, I would see him taking a bit more of a leadership position, especially after this season where he got that second in command kind of feel. I think I would see him migrating more into that leadership position, not just for, you know, himself and Abby, who he holds very close to his heart, but all of the people of Homestead, which he is now starting to wrap his head around, the idea of being a voice of reason for the mass. And I think that will come into play further down the line. Plus, I think he will also hopefully learn how to utilize his invisible disability a bit more to his advantage, hopefully at some point. But again, knowing what I know from the people who do have it, that might be hoping a lot, but it's still a hope I have for him.
You never know. Danny, I want to thank you again for spending some time with us and giving us some insight onto the character. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, sweetheart.
Homestead is a Not Another Podcast production.